I'd like to share with you from the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 29. And I'll be reading, I'll be looking at the first 17 verses. That's Proverbs chapter 29, looking at the first 17 verses. Some time ago I shared from Proverbs, the first books of Proverbs, and just to look at the experience that Job had. And I just say to myself, what was this man? Who is this man? Who was Job? What do we know about him? I think for many people, they see Job as a man of faith, a man who was tested to the limit by Satan, a man who God allowed the devil to tempt to the limit. We think of Job as a man who overcame temptation, a very rich man, and also a man that the Bible says was perfect. But what else do we know about him? And what I want to do this week is to look at what we can learn about the man Job before his temptation, before he went through what he gone through. And hopefully next week or some other time, I want to look at the man Job while he was going through these difficulties. So this morning, I want to focus primarily on who he was. Try to find something about this man. What does the Bible tell us about this man, Job? The first thing that I identified is that this man had a unique relationship with God. And the first 5 verses of chapter 29 tells us that Job had a unique relationship with God. And we need to know that the setting of this is that after Job was tested, he was tried, his children had died, and Job, as it were, was on the dump heap. Thrown out of his house, ostracized on the garbage heap, filled with sores, and he was ostracized. And this was the time that some revelation came about who this man actually was. So the first thing that we see as Job sat on that rubbish heap, as it was, and he started to reflect. The first thing that we notice here is that Job craved what he once had, but which he had lost. There was something that Job had that he craved. And by talking about it crave, it reveals some things about who he actually was, or some of the experiences that he had. I just wonder, what are some of the things that you crave this morning? What are some of the things that you once had and you look back and say, gosh, some time ago I had this. I wish today I have these things. And some people say sometimes we do not appreciate what we have until we lose it. But this was not the case with Job. It was not that he did not appreciate what he had, but it helps us. As I said, this text reveals some striking or some alarming things about this man. The first thing we notice here is that Job craved the covering that God had over him. He craved the covering that God once had over him. So in other words, Job was a man who had a special covering over him by God. And verse 2 tells us, and I'm just going to read, and the man remains, and a man who remains stiff-necked, Job 29, that's right. A man who remains stiff-necked after many rebukes. Thank you. Proverbs, Job, yeah. Thank you very much. Job continued, how long, how I longed for the months gone by, for the days when God watched over me. The days when God watched over me. It goes on to say, when his lamp shone upon my head, and by his light I walk through darkness. So what we learn from that is that God watched over him. Job said, in days gone by, I experienced God watching over me. And I'm looking at from the NIV version. God's lamp shone over his head. It's a man who experienced the covering of God over his person, over him. He said, the light of God, the glory of God shine over his head. And in the second clause of verse 3, it tells us that God's light guided him through darkness. So Job said, there was a time in the past when I had this. When I was going through difficulties or through darkness, the glory of God, the light of God would shine through the darkness and lead me on the way. What I could think of was the children of Israel as they were crossing the Red Sea. The children of Israel, the Bible tells us, even as they was going through the wilderness, the Bible tells us that the pillar of fire goes before them by night. Guidance and protection. Job was saying, here am I, sitting in this rubbish heap, but looking back on my past life, I crave those days when God covered me. God shone his light. The glory, the radiance of God seemed to come over me. But not just about himself. But in verse 4, it tells us that God was not only covering Job's person, but his home was covered. He craved the covering that God has over his home. And I'm quite sure every one of us relishes the covering over our home. To have God's protection. You know, we protect our home by alarms. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have alarms. You know, we have proper doors and we have locks to protect our homes. And yes, we need to have those. But to have the protection and the covering of God over your home is a very, very special covering or protection that we need to have here. His home was a place of peace. Peace radiates within Job's home. The relationship, according to verse 5a, tells us that the relationship that Job had with his family was exceptional. In verse 5 it says, when the Almighty was still with me and my children were around me, when my path was drenched with cream and the rock poured out from me streams of olive oil. Job had a relationship with his children that he longed for. Now, at this stage, all his kids have died. His kids have died. So he's looking back to the time when they were alive, to the time when they lived within his home, to the time when he experienced that good family relationship. God's presence was evident in the midst of Job's home. The days of having his children around him. You know, there's some people who the relationship between them and their children not good. Friction, torn apart home. But Job was saying, my relationship with my children was so good. I long for it. I look back to that and I long for such an experience. According to verse 6, it tells us that he was a man who walked with pride and dignity because of his success, because of his experience. He walked with dignity. He walked with pride, not a negative pride here now. but a man who was confident, a man who was enjoying the trappings of glory, the trappings of the blessings of God. His heart was filled with happiness and purpose. What else do we learn about Job? Not only that Job had a unique relationship with God, but we note that Job was highly respected in his community, according to verse 7 to 11. Job was highly respected in his community. The first clause of verse 7 tells us that in those days, the elder men, the respectable men, they would actually go out in the street and they would sit, and people would come to them for instruction and guidance. And Job used to do that. When I went out, I longed for the day when I went out to the gate of the city took my seat in the public square. The young men saw me and stepped aside. The King James Version says, the young men saw me and they hid from me. Not that they were fearful of him, but the level of respect that the young people have for Job was astounding. The young men, they saw me, and one translation said they fear him. They fear him. And as I've said, not a fear where you're scared of somebody, but there's a level of respect that the young people had for Job that was astonishing. I don't really want to have a go at young people today, but I must say, when you look around our world today, and I think even this week we were watching one of the television programs, and when we looked, and I was talking to Muriel there, we see how that young person was talking to his mother, the level of disrespect, and sometimes that is reflected so often on television. The level of disrespect that we see the young person was speaking to his parents with. But here, these young people highly respected Job, that they would step aside while he's coming. They gave him the reverence that he deserved. And that tells us about the character of the man. It tells us about who Job really was. In verse 8, the second clause, it says, and the old men rose to their feet. When Job stepped out in the community, when he stepped out there, the old men, they stood up in a form of reverence. When the queen goes someplace or royalty, people would bow to them. They're showing respect. In the army, when a commanding officer is passing by, they stand in respect, they salute. Here the older men, they stood up. If he's coming, they stood up, showing respect to Job. So Job is telling me that he commanded respect prior to this experience. In verse 9, and the first clause in verse 9, it says, the chief men, the nobles in one translation put it. It says, the nobles refrained from speaking and covered their mouth with their hands. They refrained from speaking. The level of awe and respect that they have to him. They listen to Job when he speaks. When they are in his presence, they want to hear what he has to say, because of the reverence that they have. The princes would listen to him in awe. The noblemen, it says here that their tongue, as it were, cleaved to their mouth. They were lost for words when they were in his presence. That is telling me of a man who commanded such respect. That people in position, people in authority, people of status would respect him. Not only children, Not only the elderly, but people of status, people of caliber. The moment they are in Job's presence, they would listen. Level of respect. Job was a man who was regarded in his community. What else do we know about Job? In verse 11 to 13, and I think this is the part that really strikes me, that he was caring. He was a caring and a generous man. Let's look at verse 11. Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me. Why? Because I rescued the poor. I rescued the poor. What Job was actually saying, he was a man who was generous. Although he was rich, he said he was the richest man of the East. But Job did not keep his riches to himself. He helped the poor. He rescued them. People who were poverty-stricken could go to Job, and Job would actually minister to their need. Job would support them, give to the poor. It also says in the second clause of verse 12, he was a father to the fatherless. He helped the fatherless. Job was a man who was not self-indulgent. He was a man who was about charity, a man who was willing to give to charity. He cared for the fatherless. The second clause of verse 13 tells us he also cared for the widows. And I read verse 13, the man who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. So we see that Job was a man who had a concern for those around him, a concern for those people who were not well off. People who had need, Job would look out for them. He blessed the widow. He met the needs of the widow. He delivered them out of their financial trouble. It also says, Job reaped the blessings from those who had perished. Those who are perishing. Because Job reached out for those who are perishing, as a result, the blessings of God came upon him. And Job gave a summary while he sat on that dump heap. Gave a summary while he sat there. In verse 15 to 17, the first clause of verse 15, it says here, I was eyes to the blind. I was eyes to the blind. It talks about the ministry that he gave to those people who are blind. I was eyes to the blind. I was feet to the lame. I was father to the needy, verse 16. I was like a lawyer to the defenseless in court, the second clause of verse 16 tells us. So in other words, even people who are defenseless, who could not defend themselves, who do not have the financial support, who do not have the moral support, Job would stand in court as a defense for these people. Even the strangers, Job would represent them. Now can you see why, looking back, why so he commands such respect? A man who was well known, a man who would minister to all those who were around him. And as a result of that, he was highly respected. The first clause of verse 17 tells us, and I read it from another translation, he break the teeth of criminals when they attack and set the victims free. Break the teeth of criminals when they attack, and he delivered the victims from their grasp. Job was a man of character, a man with reputation, a man who lived for God, a man who was respected by his community. What can we take from this as believers? That we need to crave God. We need to crave God. We need to have a relationship with God, that is very, very close. Job, his household was impeccable in terms of goodness and peace. A man who was honorable, a man who God guided his path and lead him through darkness. A man who was respected in his community. A man who was caring and generous. And a man who was able to represent those who are in need. We should take something from this morning. We cannot be Job as a person, but we can adopt the principles and the qualities that Job adopted. Our status in life, our achievement in life does not need to define who we are. Job did not allow that to define him. His relationship with God and his consciousness about people around him helped to define him and help him to command the respect from his entire community, but more so, the respect that Job had from God. Another message, I will talk to you about where Job was and how he was treated as a result of him being under temptation. Let us just bow our heads in prayer.